April 12, 1961, saw manned spaceships soar from science fiction into reality. On that date, the USSR won the first round of the space race. Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin blasted into history as the first man in space.
Major Gagarin was landing in Moscow, and Mr. K was with Yuri's wife and parents to greet him. What a hero was this young cosmonaut. Unknown one day, the next, the most publicized man in the world. In the big heart of the emotional Russian people, the man from space held the place of honor.
The United States and Russia were both racing towards the moon. The space race was on, and America was behind. But 3 weeks later, America had its own triumph with the successful launch of a manned spaceflight.
A knight in the silvery armor of the space age, astronaut Alan B. Shepard, Jr., 37-year-old Navy commander, on the memorable day when an American takes his first step into space on the road that leads to the moon.
All systems are go. All systems are go. Periscope is coming out. Periscope's coming out. Cloud cover over Florida.
Shepard's perilous 15-minute ride had catapulted him 302 miles above the Earth. With a safe return, efforts continued to achieve the next goal of putting a manned spaceship in orbit around the Earth. Over the next few months, NASA prepared by conducting unmanned test launches, including several spectacular failures.
Monkey named Goliath in its nose cone, the mighty Atlas missile is launched at Cape Canaveral, Florida. The hope is to learn how Goliath fares during a space flight. But suddenly Atlas begins to waver off course, and 30 seconds after takeoff, the range safety officer is forced to destroy it. Was to take the payload 650 miles into space. Others will follow until spaceflight is made safe for man.
In early August, Russia followed up its initial success with a second manned flight. After more than 24 hours in orbit, cosmonaut German Titov returned to a hero's welcome. In the United States, more tests were successfully completed. After a monkey was orbited around the world and safely recovered, NASA officials announced that the next ship launched would be carrying a man. Astronaut John Glenn was named to make the trip, with Scott Carpenter standing by as his backup. Glenn's flight around the Earth would be the next chapter in the journey begun by Yuri Gagarin. It was an adventure that would lead man to the surface of the moon and future space exploration. And it all began with man's first voyage into space on April 12, 1961. August 13, 1961, was the day the Cold War heated up. German citizens awoke to the sounds of the Berlin Wall being constructed. What had been a city divided by politics became a city divided by stone. When World War II ended, the defeated country of Germany and its capital city of Berlin were divided in half. The Soviet Union controlled the East, and the Allied powers of England, France, and the United States occupied the West. The city of Berlin was located inside communist-controlled East Germany, with access given to the Allies through Soviet-held territory. Since the war years, West Berlin had become a thriving industrial metropolis and was a continuing irritant to the Russians. It showed to the world, and to the East Germans in particular, the contrast between the communist and capitalist ways of life. Even worse, West Berlin was the only breach in the impenetrable Iron Curtain. It had long provided an escape route for thousands upon thousands of communism's top professionals and intellectuals. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, Berlin suddenly took center stage in the world arena. On June 15, 1961, Soviet Premier Khrushchev declared his intention to sign a treaty with East Germany, which would cut off free access to the city and terminate all Allied rights in West Berlin. The city had remained relatively quiet for almost a decade, but with this pronouncement, Khrushchev transformed it into a tinderbox. At the UN, President Kennedy made the Allied position clear.
There is a dangerous crisis in Berlin, and there is. It is because of threats against the vital interests and the deep commitments of the Western powers and the freedom of West Berlin. We cannot yield these interests. We cannot fail these commitments. We cannot surrender the freedom of these people, for whom we are responsible.
On August 13th, Russia carried through with its threat and closed the border between East and West Berlin. Within days, the Berlin Wall was erected. Kennedy responded by moving 1,500 Allied reinforcements into West Berlin, but continued a diplomatic dialogue. On October 26th, East Berlin refused to allow U.S. civilians into the city, provoking a U.S.-Russian tank standoff at the Berlin Wall. At that point, NATO leaders decided to send a clear warning of their own.
Bad weather grew steadily worse in Bavaria near the end of the 7-day NATO exercises. Among VIPs watching was Federal German Defense Minister Strauss. Helicopters demonstrated how 200 infantry could be transported in a matter of minutes to a threatened point. 60,000 American, French, and West German troops took part. 15,000 tanks and armored vehicles helped to make the operations the biggest of the kind NATO has ever staged.
On November 7th, diplomatic negotiations and common sense finally took hold. Having stopped the refugee flight to the west and having faced nuclear holocaust, Khrushchev announced that he would postpone settlement of the Berlin question. A situation that many feared would bring up the curtain on World War III had for the moment been averted. But the Berlin problem would continue for almost 30 years. In the wake of reforms in the Soviet Union, the communist domination of Eastern Europe began to wither. On November 9, 1989, border crossing points between East and West Berlin were opened for the first time since 1961. Within weeks, the Berlin Wall was dismantled, obliterating forever the symbol of a divided world.